The Scandal at Lake Como, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The Lights of Villa Serenella. The lake lay still as poured glass beneath the indigo dusk, and along its eastern shore, the lights of Villa Serenella glittered like a string of pearls dropped carelessly upon black velvet. It was, Hercule Poirot reflected as his small hired boat puttered across the water, precisely the sort of evening that Italy reserved for postcards and for murder. He had not come to Lake Como seeking either. He had come, in fact, for nothing more sinister than his digestion, which his physician in London had declared to be in want of mountain air, lake water, and a diet less encumbered by English boiled puddings. Poirot had taken rooms at a modest hotel in Bellagio, intending 3 weeks of idleness, the careful cultivation of his moustaches, and perhaps a little correspondence with his old friend Captain Hastings, presently in Argentina. It was therefore with some reluctance that he had accepted the invitation extended that afternoon by a breathless young Englishman who had practically fallen from a motor launch onto the hotel terrace, demanding to know whether the gentleman with the moustaches and the egg-shaped head was indeed the Hercule Poirot, and whether he might, as a tremendous favour, consent to dine that evening at Villa Serenella, the residence of Sir Edmund Ashworth. "You see, sir," the young man had said, twisting his hat in his hands, "it isn't really for me to ask. It's Sir Edmund himself who wishes it. He read of your exploits in the Riviera affair, and has talked of nothing else for a week. He would consider it the greatest honour." Poirot, who was not above a little honest vanity, had consented. The villa, as the boat drew nearer, revealed itself to be a structure of considerable grandeur. Pale stone walls rising in elegant terraces from the water's edge, cypress trees standing sentinel along gravel paths, and lit windows behind which moved the shapes of men and women dressed for dinner. A boathouse jutted into the lake at the villa's northern corner, and Poirot noted, with the automatic attention to detail that had served him so well in 30 years of detection, that a second launch was already moored there, its brass fittings catching the last of the light. He was met at the small private dock by a manservant of grave Italian dignity, who conducted him up a flight of stone steps bordered with oleander, and into a drawing-room of considerable opulence, where the assembled company turned, as one, to inspect the new arrival. Sir Edmund Ashworth came forward first, a tall man of perhaps 60 years, silver-haired, with the ruddy complexion of one who has made his fortune in industry and intends to enjoy the spending of it. His handshake was firm, his smile broad, though Poirot's eye, never idle, detected beneath the geniality a certain watchfulness, as of a man accustomed to being deceived and therefore disinclined to trust appearances. "Monsieur Poirot, what an extraordinary pleasure. You must forgive the impertinence of young Gerald here," he gestured to the breathless youth from the terrace, "in practically abducting you from your hotel, but when one learns that the great detective is holidaying not 3 miles distant, one does not stand on ceremony." "It is I who am honoured, Sir Edmund," Poirot replied with a small bow. "Your villa is magnificent. Built it myself 10 years back. Ruined 3 Italian architects doing it. But there you are." Sir Edmund laughed, a sound too loud for the room, and turned to make the introductions. There was Gerald Ashworth, the nephew, fair-haired and earnest, who had fetched Poirot from Bellagio, and who hovered now near a young woman of striking dark beauty. Miss Vera Conti, introduced as Sir Edmund's private secretary, though the warmth with which Gerald regarded her suggested a relationship extending somewhat beyond the professional. There was Lady Ashworth, the second Lady Ashworth, as Poirot would shortly learn, a woman some 20 years her husband's junior, exquisitely gowned in ivory silk, with pale gold hair and eyes the colour of the lake itself, eyes that moved restlessly about the room as though perpetually seeking an exit. There was Mr. Charles Trevelyan, Sir Edmund's business partner of some 20 years' standing, a heavy-set man with a florid face and the air of one nursing a private grievance. There was Dr. Aldo Ferrante, the family physician and an old friend of the house, slight and silver-spectacled, who shook Poirot's hand with evident scholarly interest. And there was, finally, seated somewhat apart near the tall windows that opened onto the terrace, an elderly woman in black, whom Sir Edmund introduced, with a curious flatness of tone, as my late brother's widow, Mrs. Henrietta Ashworth, who keeps house for me here. Poirot bowed to each in turn, storing away, as was his habit, the small details that presented themselves. The way Lady Ashworth's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she lifted her glass. The manner in which Mr. Trevelyan's eyes followed Sir Edmund about the room with an expression that was not quite friendship. The fact that Mrs. Henrietta Ashworth, dressed in mourning though her husband had been dead, as Poirot would later learn, some 7 years, sat with her hands folded in her lap, like a woman awaiting a verdict. "You will dine with us, of course," Sir Edmund was saying, "and afterward, if I might be so bold, I should value enormously a few moments of your time. There is a small matter, a private matter, on which I should welcome your professional opinion. But of course, Sir Edmund, I am entirely at your disposal." It was a promise Poirot would have cause to remember, for Sir Edmund Ashworth would not live to claim it. Chapter 2. A toast unfinished dinner was served upon the terrace, beneath strings of small electric lights threaded through the cypresses, with the lake murmuring softly below, and the mountains rising dark and immense, against a sky now thick with stars. It was, Poirot thought, a scene of perfect tranquillity, marred only by the undercurrents he had already begun to sense moving beneath the surface of polite conversation as eels move beneath still water. The talk ranged over many subjects, Sir Edmund's business interests, which were considerable and various, touching upon textiles, shipping, and lately a venture into Italian vineyards, the beauty of the lake, the scandalous behaviour of a mutual acquaintance recently divorced in London. Poirot, seated between Lady Ashworth and Dr. Ferrante, listened more than he spoke, his small dark eyes moving from face to face with the patient attentiveness of a man assembling a puzzle whose final picture he could not yet guess. He noticed that Mr. Trevelyan drank a great deal of wine, and that each glass seemed to loosen, rather than soften, his temper. At one point, when Sir Edmund made some jesting remark about the vineyard venture, "Charles thinks I've thrown good money after bad, don't you, old man?" Trevelyan's reply came clipped and cold. "I think a man ought to consult his partner before signing away £40,000, Edmund. That is what I think." A small silence fell. Sir Edmund laughed it away, but Poirot observed that his hand, beneath the table's edge, had tightened upon his napkin. He noticed too the manner of Gerald Ashworth toward his uncle. A deference shot through with something harder, something almost resentful, that surfaced briefly when Sir Edmund remarked, apropos of nothing, "Gerald here will inherit the lot one day, won't you, my boy? Though I've half a mind to leave it all to the cat's home, the way you spend money on motor launches." It was said lightly, as an uncle's joke, but Gerald's face, for an instant, had gone quite white, and Miss Vera Conti's hand had found his beneath the tablecloth, a small gesture of comfort that Poirot, watching, did not fail to register, and he noticed Lady Ashworth, who ate almost nothing, who answered questions put to her with a brightness that did not reach her eyes, and who started visibly when, toward the end of the meal, a servant approached to murmur something in Sir Edmund's ear. "Telephone, Sir Edmund, from Milan." "Tell them I shall ring back in the morning," Sir Edmund said, waving the man away. "I'll not have business at my own table." He turned back to the company with a broad smile. "Now then, I propose a toast to new friendships and to the great Monsieur Poirot, who has done us the honour of his company this evening." Glasses were raised. Poirot inclined his head in modest acknowledgment. "And," Sir Edmund continued, his voice taking on a note Poirot could not quite identify, something between mischief and menace, "to honesty among friends. For I find of late that I have been keeping rather too many secrets that are not, strictly speaking, my own to keep." That state of affairs, I think, is shortly to change. It was a curious thing to say, and it produced a curious effect. Mr. Trevelyan's glass paused halfway to his lips. Lady Ashworth's fingers whitened upon the stem of her own glass. Mrs. Henrietta Ashworth, silent throughout the meal, looked up sharply from her place at the table's foot, her dark eyes fixed upon her brother-in-law with an expression Poirot could only describe as fear. Sir Edmund, apparently satisfied with the effect of his words, laughed and drank. But that is a discussion for another time. Monsieur Poirot, you spoke of a private matter you wished to discuss with me after dinner. Shall we say 10:30 in my study? I have something to show you that I think will interest you considerably. I shall be entirely at your service, Sir Edmund. The meal concluded shortly thereafter with coffee and liqueurs taken upon the terrace, the company drifting into smaller groups as the evening deepened. Poirot, declining a second glass of grappa, took the opportunity to stroll the length of the terrace, ostensibly admiring the view, in reality observing. He saw Gerald Ashworth and Vera Conti withdraw to a shadowed corner near the balustrade, their heads bent close in urgent conversation. He saw Mr. Trevelyan disappear into the house with the heavy tread of a man seeking solitude, or perhaps simply more wine. He saw Lady Ashworth standing quite alone at the terrace's edge, gazing out over the dark water, her arms wrapped about herself as though against a cold that the warm Italian night could not explain. And at 10:30 precisely, when Poirot made his way to the study as arranged, he found the door ajar, the lamp burning upon the desk, and Sir Edmund Ashworth nowhere to be found. Chapter 3. The Find at the Boathouse. It was Dr. Ferrante who found him, some 40 minutes later, when the absence of their host had begun to occasion comment among the remaining guests, and a search of the villa had been quietly organised. Poirot, who had joined the search at the urging of an increasingly anxious Gerald Ashworth, was crossing the lower terrace toward the boathouse when he heard the doctor's cry, sharp, strangled, entirely unlike the measured tones in which the man had conducted himself throughout dinner. He found Ferrante kneeling upon the small wooden dock within the boathouse, the lantern he carried throwing wild shadows across the water, where Sir Edmund Ashworth lay face down, fully dressed, one arm trailing in the lake as though he had simply leaned too far and toppled in. "Help me," Ferrante said hoarsely. "Help me get him out." Between them they drew the body onto the dock. Poirot, even in that first urgent moment, observed with the cold clarity that crime had long ago taught him to summon, the absence of any great quantity of water expelled from the lungs when Ferrante, with the automatic reflex of his profession, attempted resuscitation, a peculiar blue tinge about the lips that seemed, to Poirot's experienced eye, inconsistent with simple drowning, the small mark, no larger than a pinprick, upon the inside of the dead man's wrist, nearly hidden by his shirt cuff. "He is dead," Ferrante said at last, sitting back on his heels, his spectacles askew, his scholarly composure entirely shattered. "Mon Dieu, forgive me, I lapse into French when I am distressed. He is dead, Monsieur Poirot. He has been dead, I think, for perhaps half an hour. You are quite certain it is drowning?" Ferrante looked up sharply. "What else would it be? He is found in the water. A man may be placed in water, cher docteur, as easily as he may fall into it." Poirot crouched beside the body, his eyes moving with methodical care over every visible detail, the soaked evening clothes, the silver hair plastered dark against the skull, the small wound upon the wrist that the doctor, in his haste, had not yet remarked. "Tell me, this mark here, have you observed it?" Ferrante leaned closer, adjusting his spectacles. His face, already pale, grew paler still. That could be an injection mark, Monsieur Poirot. Quite fresh, précisément. And a man does not as a rule inject himself before falling accidentally into a lake. By now the alarm had spread through the villa, and the small dock began to fill with the household. Gerald Ashworth, white-faced and shaking, Vera Conti with her hand pressed to her mouth. Lady Ashworth, who upon seeing her husband's body gave a single sharp cry and would have fallen had Mr. Trevelyan, arriving close behind her, not caught her by the arm. Mrs. Henrietta Ashworth, who stood somewhat apart from the others, her dark eyes fixed upon the dead man with an expression that Poirot, watching closely even amid the general confusion, found himself entirely unable to read. Whether grief, or horror, or something closer to a terrible relief. "We must call the authorities," Poirot said quietly, rising to his feet and brushing the gravel from his knees. "Dr. Ferrante, you will permit no one to disturb the body, and no one is to leave the villa tonight. I am sorry to impose such conditions upon a house already so stricken with grief, but I fear, mes amis, that what has happened here this evening is not an accident." "Not an accident?" Trevelyan's voice was rough. "What the devil do you mean, sir?" Poirot regarded him steadily. "I mean, Monsieur Trevelyan, that I believe Sir Edmund Ashworth has been murdered." The word fell among them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples of it, Poirot would observe in the hours and days that followed, touched every soul within that villa, though not all of them in the manner that grief alone might explain. Chapter 4. The Study and the Locked Drawer. The Italian police, summoned by telephone within the hour, arrived in the person of Commissario Bruno Salviati, a brisk, capable man of middle years who had, fortunately for the proceedings, spent some years in London in his youth and spoke excellent English. He listened with evident respect to Poirot's account of the evening's events, examined the body with his own physician, and pronounced himself entirely willing to avail himself of the great detective's assistance, a courtesy not always extended by officers of the law, but one which Poirot, with characteristic modesty, accepted as no more than his due. "The post-mortem will confirm it," Salviati said, as the body was carried away under sheets. "But I think you are correct, Monsieur Poirot. That mark upon the wrist, it is consistent with a hypodermic needle. We shall know more by morning, but I do not think Sir Edmund drowned. I think he was already dead, or dying, when he entered the water." "My thought precisely, Commissario. And if I am not mistaken, you will find that he was not killed in the boathouse at all, but elsewhere, and brought there afterward." "What makes you say this?" Poirot gestured toward the dock. "Observe, Commissario, the gravel path leading from the terrace to the boathouse. It has been disturbed, not by the ordinary footsteps of a man walking, but by something dragged, here and here, where the small stones have been pushed aside in a long, continuous furrow. A man who walks to his death leaves footprints. A man who is carried or dragged leaves a furrow such as this." Salviati examined the path with his torch and grunted in reluctant admiration. "You are correct. I had not observed it in the dark. It is a small thing, but small things, Commissario, are very often the whole of the matter." Poirot straightened, smoothing his moustaches with one careful finger. Now, Sir Edmund had asked me to meet him in his study at 10:30, on a matter he described as private, and one he wished my professional opinion upon. When I arrived, he was already gone. I think we should examine that study most carefully, for I believe whatever he wished to show me may hold the key to why he died. The study, a handsome room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a great mahogany desk, yielded its secrets only grudgingly. The desk drawers, Poirot found upon examination, were for the most part unlocked and contained nothing more remarkable than business correspondence, household accounts, and a quantity of cigars. One drawer, however, the lowest upon the desk's right-hand side, proved to be locked fast, and no key was found upon the dead man's person, nor anywhere within the room. "Curious," Poirot murmured, running his fingers along the drawer's edge. "A man who locks but one drawer among many is a man who keeps but one secret of any real weight." "We can force it," Salviati suggested. "By all means, Commissario, though I think we shall find it has been visited already this evening, and not by its rightful owner. His instinct proved correct. When the lock had been forced, the drawer was found to contain a quantity of papers in some disorder. The disorder, Poirot judged, of a search conducted hastily and without great care for concealment, along with an empty leather folder whose embossed lettering read, in faded gilt, strictly private, H.A. and a small portrait photograph, evidently some 20 years old, of a young woman whom neither Poirot nor Salviati recognized, inscribed upon the reverse in a faded hand, "To Edmund, with all my love, always, Henrietta." Poirot studied the inscription for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "Henrietta," he said softly. "That is the name, Commissario, of Sir Edmund's sister-in-law, the widow of his late brother, who keeps his house for him." He turned the photograph over once more, examining the young face it bore, a face that bore, now Poirot looked closely, an unmistakable resemblance to the elderly woman in black who had sat at the foot of the dinner table that evening, watchful and silent. "You think there is some connection? Mon ami, in matters of murder, there is always some connection. The art lies in discovering of what nature it is." Poirot folded the photograph carefully into his breast pocket. "I think, Commissario, that tomorrow I shall have a long conversation with Madame Henrietta Ashworth, and I think, also, that I should very much like to know what was contained in that empty folder and who removed it before either of us had the opportunity to see it." Chapter 5. The Widow in Black. Morning brought with it the soft grey light peculiar to Italian lakes, a mist rising from the water's surface that lent the villa and its gardens an air of unreality, as though the events of the previous night might yet prove to have been some elaborate and dreadful imagining. They were not, of course. Sir Edmund Ashworth's body had been removed to Como for formal examination, and the household that remained at Villa Serenella moved through their morning routines with the stunned, careful gait of people walking through a house they no longer quite recognized as their own. Poirot, breakfasting alone upon the terrace at an hour he privately considered civilized but which the rest of the household evidently did not share, was joined first by Commissario Salviati, bearing news from the post-mortem examination conducted in the small hours. "Confirmed," Salviati said, seating himself with the weary satisfaction of a man whose suspicions have proven correct. Sir Edmund did not drown. He was injected with a substantial dose of digitalis, enough to stop the heart of a far younger and healthier man within minutes. The water in his lungs is minimal, consistent with a body placed in the lake after death, not before. "Digitalis," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "A medicine, then, turned to murderous purpose. Tell me, Commissario, who among the household had access to such a substance?" "Dr. Ferrante, of course, as the family physician. He keeps a small dispensary in the villa for emergencies. I have seen it myself, in a locked cabinet in his room. We are having it examined this morning." "And the cabinet, it was locked, you say?" "He claims it was. We shall see whether it remains so." Poirot considered this in silence for a moment, his eyes fixed upon the lake, where a single white sail moved with deceptive tranquillity across the water. "It is interesting, is it not, Commissario, that a man should choose so medical a method of murder, in a house where the physician himself is so conveniently present to be suspected? Either Dr. Ferrante is remarkably careless of his own safety, or someone wished very particularly that suspicion should fall upon him. You think he is innocent? I think, mon ami, that it is far too early to think anything at all with certainty. But I have learned, in 30 years of this work, to be suspicious of solutions that present themselves too readily, wrapped, as it were, in a neat bow for our convenience. Poirot rose from the table, dabbing his moustaches with his napkin. Now, I think it is time I spoke with Madame Henrietta Ashworth. He found her in a small sitting-room overlooking the garden, dressed still in unrelieved black, her hands occupied with needlework that did not, Poirot observed, appear to be progressing with any great speed. She looked up at his entrance with an expression carefully composed, though her eyes, when they met his, held a wariness that confirmed every suspicion he had formed the previous evening. "Monsieur Poirot, I had wondered when you would come to me." "You expected it, madame." "I expected that a man of your reputation would not be content with the obvious explanations." She set aside her needlework with a small, resigned sigh. "What is it you wish to know?" And Poirot seated himself across from her, withdrawing from his breast pocket the photograph he had found the previous night, and laying it gently upon the table between them. "I wish to know, madame, why Sir Edmund kept, locked away among his private papers, a photograph of a young woman who signs herself Henrietta, inscribed with words of love that seem, if I may say so, rather warmer than those one customarily addresses to a brother's wife." For a long moment, Henrietta Ashworth said nothing at all. Then, with the slow weariness of a woman setting down a burden she has carried too long, she said, "Because, Monsieur Poirot, Edmund Ashworth was not my brother-in-law. He was, 22 years ago, the man I loved, and the man who broke that love, and my heart along with it, when he chose his brother's fortune over my hand." Chapter 6. A Confession of the Past. "You will think it a sordid story," Henrietta Ashworth continued, her voice steady now, as though the telling of it, long delayed, brought with it a certain bitter relief. "It is, I suppose, sordid enough. I was 21 when I met Edmund Ashworth, and his brother William besides. They were partners then in a small shipping concern. Neither of them possessed of great fortune, though Edmund had always the larger ambition. I loved Edmund first. We were engaged, Monsieur Poirot, for the better part of a year. And what occurred to end this engagement? William died. William, the elder brother, who held the greater share in the business, and stood to inherit a considerable sum from an uncle in Bristol, provided he married before his 30th birthday, which was then but 6 months distant. It was a foolish condition, the whim of a sentimental old man. But the fortune was not foolish, and Edmund— She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "Edmund persuaded his brother that I should marry him instead. He told me it was for the good of the family, that the money would benefit us all in time, that once William had secured the inheritance, matters might somehow be arranged. I was young. I believed him. I married William Ashworth within the month, and inherited, in time, both his fortune and his name, while Edmund built his own empire upon the foundation that fortune provided. And William, did he know of this arrangement, this prior understanding between yourself and his brother? He never knew. I do not think he would have forgiven either of us, had he learned of it. He was a good man, Monsieur Poirot, a far better man than his brother, though I did not love him as I had loved Edmund. We were married 12 years before his death, and I grieved him honestly, whatever my heart's earlier history. And after his death, you remained within Edmund's household. What else was I to do? I had no fortune of my own. William's money had been largely tied up in the business, which passed, upon his death, into Edmund's sole control. Edmund offered me a home, a position of respectability, and her voice caught, I confess, Monsieur Poirot, that some part of me hoped, in those early months of widowhood, that the old understanding between us might be revived. I was a fool. Edmund had no further use for me, beyond what use I might be made to serve. What use was that, madame? Her eyes, when they met his, were hard with old anger. Silence, Monsieur Poirot, my silence regarding the manner in which his fortune had been secured. He paid for it well enough, a comfortable home, a generous allowance, but it was payment all the same, and I have grown very tired, these past 7 years, of being a kept secret in my own dead husband's house. Poirot sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment. Last evening, madame, Sir Edmund made a curious toast at dinner, to honesty among friends, and to a state of affairs he described as shortly to change, regarding secrets he had been keeping that were not, he said, strictly his own to keep. Do you know to what he referred? A shadow of genuine fear crossed Henrietta Ashworth's face. I had wondered, I had feared, that he meant to speak of our history. Edmund had grown strange these past weeks, Monsieur Poirot. Reckless. He spoke once or twice of setting matters right, before it was too late, of unburdening himself of obligations long carried. I did not know whether he meant to confess our old arrangement, or whether he referred to some other matter entirely. I confess I went to bed last night fearing the worst, not his death, Monsieur Poirot, but the ruin of what little respectability remained to me. And did you visit his study, madame, at any point after dinner? The question hung between them. Henrietta Ashworth's gaze did not waver, but her hands, Poirot observed, had gone very still in her lap. No, Monsieur Poirot, I did not. It was, Poirot reflected as he took his leave of her some minutes later, a denial offered with admirable composure, and one he was not yet entirely inclined to believe. Chapter 7. The Quarrel of Partners. The examination of Dr. Ferrante's medical cabinet, conducted that afternoon under Commissario Salviati's supervision, yielded a result both expected and troubling. The lock, though appearing intact, showed faint scratches about its mechanism, consistent with having been picked, and a bottle of digitalis tincture, though present, contained noticeably less than the doctor's own records indicated ought to remain. I tell you I locked it myself, after using a small quantity for Sir Edmund's own heart condition some weeks past, Ferrante insisted, his scholarly composure considerably frayed. Sir Edmund suffered from an irregular heartbeat. It is why I kept the digitalis at all. Anyone in this house might have known of its presence, for I make no secret of my profession or my dispensary. And who doctor knew specifically where the cabinet was kept, and that it remained, on occasion, unlocked during the day? Ferrante's hands trembled slightly as he replaced his instruments. Everyone, Monsieur Poirot. The household staff enter my room daily to clean. The family come and go as they please. This is not London, where one stands on such ceremony. I cannot tell you that any one person, to the exclusion of all others, possessed the opportunity. It was, Poirot reflected, an answer both honest and entirely unhelpful. The digitalis, it seemed, had been available to nearly the whole of the household, and the means of murder, therefore, narrowed the field of suspects not at all. He turned his attention that afternoon to Mr. Charles Trevelyan, whom he found upon the lower terrace, smoking a cigar with the grim concentration of a man seeking to steady badly shaken nerves. Monsieur Trevelyan, I wonder if I might trouble you for a few moments. I rather thought you might, sooner or later. Trevelyan gestured to the chair beside him without great enthusiasm. Go on, then. Ask your questions. You and Sir Edmund were partners of some 20 years, I believe. 22, to be precise. I have given the better part of my working life to that man's enterprises. There was bitterness in the words, ill-concealed. And yet, last evening at dinner, you spoke to him with some considerable anger regarding a matter of £40,000 invested without your consultation. Trevelyan's jaw tightened. It is no secret, Monsieur Poirot, that Edmund and I had differences regarding the management of our affairs. He had grown reckless these past 2 years, throwing money into ventures of dubious merit, the vineyard scheme being only the latest. I had begun to suspect, in fact, that his judgment was failing him more generally, and I had taken steps, legal steps, to protect my own interests in the partnership, steps which Edmund had only recently discovered and which had occasioned, I will not deny it, considerable unpleasantness between us. What manner of steps, Monsieur Trevelyan? I had consulted a solicitor in Milan regarding the possibility of dissolving our partnership and recovering my capital independently. Edmund discovered the correspondence, I do not know how, for I had been most careful, and confronted me with it not 3 days past. He was furious, Monsieur Poirot. He accused me of disloyalty, of conspiring behind his back, and threatened, in his anger, to ruin me utterly, to spread word among our business associates that I was a man not to be trusted. a charge that would have destroyed 20 years of careful reputation in a single season. And last night, at his toast, when he spoke of honesty among friends and secrets soon to be revealed, did you fear he referred to this matter, your dealings with the Milan solicitor? Trevelyan's cigar had gone out between his fingers, unnoticed. I feared exactly that, Monsieur Poirot. I will not pretend otherwise, for I imagine you would see through any pretense I attempted. I went to bed last night in a state of considerable apprehension, wondering whether by morning my reputation, and very possibly my fortune, would lie in ruins. He looked up, meeting Poirot's gaze with something approaching defiance. But I did not kill him for it. Whatever else you may suspect of me, I had no need to murder Edmund Ashworth. His death has thrown our affairs into chaos that will take months, perhaps years, to untangle. Chaos that serves my interests not at all. It was, Poirot reflected, a reasonable argument, and yet reasonable arguments, in his long experience, were very often the favoured refuge of the guilty. Chapter 8. The Secret of the Secretary. It was Vera Conti who provided, that evening, the first crack in the smooth surface of the household's collective composure, though it came not through Poirot's questioning, but through a private conversation overheard, quite by accident, as Poirot took his customary evening turn about the garden. He had paused beneath the shadow of a great cypress, contemplating the lake and the small, methodical workings of his mind, when voices reached him from a nearby arbour, voices raised in the urgent, half-suppressed tones of lovers in distress. "Cannot keep silent forever, Gerald. They will find out regardless, and it will look far worse if it comes from someone else's lips than from our own." "And what then? You think they'll believe it was nothing more than what it appears? My God, Vera, do you understand what they'll think? What they're already half-thinking?" "I understand precisely what they'll think, which is why we must tell the truth before suspicion forces our hand." Poirot, who made it a point of professional principle never to apologize for the overhearing of conversations relevant to a case of murder, made his presence known with a discreet cough and a polite, "Forgive the intrusion, but I think, mes enfants, that you had better tell me what truth it is you speak of, before suspicion, as mademoiselle so wisely observes, forces the matter regardless." Gerald Ashworth went white. Vera Conti, to her credit, recovered her composure first. "You had better know it from us, Monsieur Poirot, rather than discover it through some less sympathetic channel. Gerald and I are engaged to be married, secretly for the present, for Sir Edmund did not approve." "Why did he not approve, mademoiselle?" "Because," Gerald said, finding his voice at last, "my uncle wished me to marry well. An heiress, a title, some advantageous match that would consolidate the family's position. He considered Vera, his hand found hers, beneath such ambitions, whatever her own merits. He told me, not a fortnight past, that if I persisted in this attachment, he would alter his will and leave the whole of his fortune elsewhere." "And did you persist, Monsieur Gerald?" "I told him I would marry whom I pleased, will or no will." There was a flash of old anger in the young man's eyes, quickly suppressed. "We quarrelled badly over it. He said things, cruel things, about Vera's family, her position, her suitability. I left his study in a fury that night, and I do not mind telling you, Monsieur Poirot, that I said things to him in turn that I have regretted every hour since." "What manner of things?" Gerald's voice dropped. "I told him I wished he were dead, that I was tired of dancing to his tune for the sake of an inheritance I'd sooner refuse than purchase at such a price. It was said in anger, Monsieur Poirot, the foolish anger of a young man thwarted in love. I did not mean it. I would never have—" He broke off, unable to complete the sentence. "When did this quarrel take place?" 2 days before he died." Poirot regarded the young couple with grave consideration. "And last evening, when Sir Edmund spoke at dinner of secrets soon to be revealed, did either of you fear he referred to your engagement?" Vera Conti nodded slowly. "I feared it above all else, Monsieur Poirot. I feared he meant to announce, before the whole company, that Gerald's inheritance was forfeit, and to expose our engagement as a piece of fortune-hunting on my part, which it is not, whatever he believed. You did not, either of you, visit Sir Edmund's study after dinner? No, Gerald said quickly. Too quickly, Poirot thought, for a young man with nothing to hide. I remained upon the terrace the whole evening, as you yourself observed, Monsieur Poirot. Vera was with me. It was, Poirot reflected as he made his way back toward the villa beneath the darkening sky, a story that explained much, and yet failed, as every story he had so far gathered failed, to account fully for the small, precise details of the crime itself. The locked drawer, the missing folder, the careful staging of a death meant to resemble accident. Somewhere within this household of secrets, one secret remained yet unspoken, and Poirot intended, before the week was out, to uncover it. Chapter 9. Lady Ashworth's Confession. It was Lady Ashworth, Cynthia, as Poirot had by now learned her Christian name to be, who at last, on the evening of the third day, sought him out rather than waiting to be sought, finding him alone upon the terrace as the sun set blood-red behind the western mountains. Monsieur Poirot, I think it is time I told you the truth before you uncover it yourself and think the worse of me for my silence. I am listening, madame. She sat, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled visibly now, all pretense of composure abandoned. I did not love my husband, Monsieur Poirot. I will not insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. I married Edmund 3 years ago because my family's fortunes had failed, and his offer represented security I could not afford to refuse. He knew this, I think, and did not mind it greatly. He wanted, I believe, a young and ornamental wife to grace his table, and I provided that function adequately enough. And did Sir Edmund know that your affections lay elsewhere? The directness of the question produced for the first time a genuine flush of colour in Lady Ashworth's pale face. How did you, she began, then stopped herself with a small, bitter laugh. Of course you knew. You have made it your business to know everything in this house, it seems. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. There was, another. A man I knew before my marriage, whom circumstance and poverty forced me to abandon for Edmund's fortune. We have corresponded since, nothing more. I swear it, but the correspondence itself would have been scandal enough, had Edmund discovered it. And had he discovered it, madame? Her hands twisted in her lap. I believe he had. Some 3 weeks past, I found my writing desk disturbed, letters out of order, a drawer I was certain I had locked left open. I said nothing, hoping I had imagined it, but Edmund's manner toward me changed thereafter, a coldness, a watchfulness, as though he waited for some confirmation he had not yet fully secured. When he spoke at dinner of secrets soon to be revealed, I confess, Monsieur Poirot, that my blood ran cold. I thought he meant to expose me before the whole company, to humiliate me as a faithless wife, perhaps to seek a divorce that would leave me with nothing, not even the small dignity of my position. Did you then visit his study after dinner, madame? To plead with him, perhaps, or to discover what he intended? For a long moment, Lady Ashworth said nothing. Then, very quietly, Yes, Monsieur Poirot, I did. I went to his study at perhaps 10:15, hoping to speak with him before whatever scene he intended to make. But he was not there. The room was empty, the lamp burning, and she hesitated. I confess I looked through his desk, Monsieur Poirot, hoping to find my letters, to remove the evidence of my indiscretion before he could use it against me. I found the locked drawer, but I had no key, and I did not dare force it for fear of discovery. I left the room within a few minutes, no wiser than when I had entered, and returned to the terrace, where I remained until the alarm was raised. You saw no one else, madame, during this brief excursion? She frowned, considering. I thought, though I cannot be certain, for the corridor was dim, I thought I glimpsed someone near the boathouse path as I returned to the terrace. A shape, no more, moving quickly toward the lower garden. I did not think it significant at the time. I was too occupied with my own fears to give it proper attention. Can you say, madame, whether this shape was that of a man or a woman? I cannot, Monsieur Poirot. I am sorry. It was no more than a shadow glimpsed in passing, and the light was very poor. It was little enough, and yet, Poirot reflected as Lady Ashworth withdrew, white-faced, into the gathering dark, it was the first concrete suggestion that someone had indeed been abroad in the lower garden, near the boat-house, at very nearly the hour of Sir Edmund's death. The question that remained, and which Poirot turned over carefully in his mind as the stars emerged one by one above the silent lake, was which of the several troubled souls within Villa Serenella that Shadow had belonged to. Chapter 10. The Little Grey Cells at Work. That night, unable to sleep, Poirot sat long at the window of his guest chamber, the lake a sheet of black silk beneath a rising moon, and turned the case over in his mind with the patient, methodical care he brought to all such puzzles, arranging and rearranging the pieces, testing each against the others, discarding what did not fit, and examining closely what remained. 4 suspects, each possessed of motive: Henrietta Ashworth, whose old wound and present dependency Sir Edmund's careless toast had threatened to expose; Charles Trevelyan, whose secret dealings and threatened ruin Sir Edmund had discovered, and meant, perhaps, to punish; Gerald Ashworth, whose inheritance and whose love Sir Edmund had threatened in a single cruel stroke; and Lady Ashworth, whose faithless correspondence Sir Edmund's discovery had placed in mortal jeopardy. Each had opportunity, in the loosely supervised confusion of that dinner party, to slip away unnoticed for the brief span of minutes the murder would have required. Each, given the open and careless manner in which Dr. Ferranti's dispensary was kept, might have obtained the digitalis that had stopped Sir Edmund's heart, and each had a powerful motive to silence, before it could be spoken aloud, whatever confession Sir Edmund had intended to make. And yet, Poirot frowned into the darkness, something did not fit. The locked drawer, the missing folder, its contents unknown, its absence noted but unexplained. If the murder had been a crime of passion, committed in haste by a guest desperate to prevent some imminent confession, why the careful staging of the body in the boat-house, the deliberate creation of an appearance of accident? Why the locked drawer, forced open not by the murderer in the moments after the crime, but, Poirot was nearly certain, before the murder had even taken place? For that was the detail that troubled him most. The disturbance to the desk, the missing folder. These spoke not of panic, not of a crime committed in the heat of sudden fear, but of preparation. Someone had known, before that fatal dinner, precisely what Sir Edmund intended to reveal, and had taken steps to remove the evidence of it even before the murder occurred. Which meant, Poirot reasoned, sitting forward suddenly in his chair, as the pieces at last began to align themselves into a pattern his mind could grasp, that the murderer had not acted upon the spur of the moment, in panic at Sir Edmund's dinner-table toast. The murderer had known what was coming, had planned for it, had prepared the ground with care, and had used Sir Edmund's own toast, that public declaration of impending honesty, merely as the trigger for a crime already fully formed in intention. But who, among the household, had possessed such advanced knowledge of Sir Edmund's intentions? Who had been close enough to his confidence to know, before that evening, precisely what secret he meant to reveal, and to whom? Poirot's mind returned, with sudden and sharpened focus, to the empty folder marked Strictly Private, H.A., and to the photograph of a young Henrietta, inscribed with words of love, some 22 years past. He had assumed, perhaps too readily, that this folder pertained solely to the old history between Sir Edmund and his sister-in-law. But what if it had contained something more, some document, some proof, pertaining not to the past alone, but to a present arrangement of which Henrietta Ashworth, in her interview with him, had not spoken? There was one possibility he had not yet fully explored. one thread he had noted but not yet pulled. He rose from his chair, crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of his room, and drew out his notebook, in which he had recorded, with characteristic precision, the small details of the case thus far observed. And there, reviewing his notes by lamplight in the small hours before dawn, Hercule Poirot found, at last, the single thread that, once pulled, would unravel the whole tangled fabric of the case. Chapter 11. The Matter of the Will. The thread, when Poirot pulled it the following morning, led him not to any of the 4 suspects he had so carefully examined, but to a 5th party whose presence in the household he had, until that moment, somewhat undervalued. Mr. Whitmore, Sir Edmund's solicitor, summoned from London upon news of his client's death, who arrived at Villa Serenella on the morning of the 4th day, bearing, among his professional effects, a copy of Sir Edmund Ashworth's last will and testament. "I had a letter from Sir Edmund not 10 days before his death," Whitmore explained, a precise, grey-haired man with the careful manner of his profession, as he sat with Poirot and Commissario Salviati in the late Sir Edmund's study. "He instructed me to draw up amendments to his will, amendments of a most particular nature, which I confess troubled me considerably, though it was not my place to question my client's wishes." "What manner of amendments, Monsieur Whitmore?" Sir Edmund wished to acknowledge, formally and legally, an obligation he had long concealed. "He instructed me to establish a substantial trust, some £60,000, in favour of a child born out of wedlock some 20 years past, the result of a liaison conducted before his marriage to the present Lady Ashworth, indeed before his marriage to his first wife. He wished, he told me, to make what amends he could before it was, in his words, too late for honesty." Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. "And the mother of this child, Monsieur Whitmore, did Sir Edmund name her?" Whitmore consulted his papers. "He did, Monsieur Poirot, though he swore me to the strictest confidence regarding the matter, until such time as the will might be formally executed. The child's mother was a Mrs. Henrietta Ashworth, though at the time of the child's birth, you understand, she went by her maiden name, the liaison having occurred some years before her marriage to Sir Edmund's late brother." The room fell silent. Poirot sat very still, his mind racing through the implications of this revelation. "Then the child Madame Henrietta bore was Sir Edmund's, not William's." "So Sir Edmund informed me, Monsieur Poirot, though I confess I cannot independently verify the claim. The child, a daughter, was given up for adoption shortly after birth, under circumstances of great secrecy. Sir Edmund believed, I understood from our correspondence, that she had grown to adulthood somewhere in Italy. Indeed, he had only recently, through private inquiries, established contact with her, though whether she yet knew the truth of her parentage, I cannot say." Poirot rose abruptly and crossed to the window, his mind working with furious speed. "Monsieur Whitmore, the folder we discovered in Sir Edmund's locked drawer, marked H.A., do you know what it might have contained?" "I believe, Monsieur Poirot, it would have contained the private inquiry reports Sir Edmund commissioned regarding his daughter's whereabouts and identity. Reports, I understand, he had only recently received, and which prompted, I believe, his decision to make formal provision for her in his will. And if those reports identified the daughter as someone already present in this household, someone close enough to Sir Edmund to have learned perhaps of his intentions before they were ever spoken aloud at that fatal dinner table, Commissario Salviati, following the thread of Poirot's reasoning, sat suddenly upright. "You think the murderer is this daughter, Monsieur Poirot? That she learned of her true parentage, and of the inheritance it threatened to divert from others closer to Sir Edmund's heart, and killed him to prevent its formal acknowledgement, or perhaps to prevent some other consequence of that revelation?" "I think, Commissario," Poirot said slowly, his eyes still fixed upon the lake beyond the window, "that we have been asking the wrong question entirely. We have asked who among the household had reason to fear Sir Edmund's confession of their own secrets. We have not yet asked who had reason to fear the confession of a secret belonging to someone else, a secret whose revelation might cost them, not their own reputation, but something they valued far more dearly. I think, Commissario, it is time we examined rather more closely the household staff of Villa Serenella, and in particular, the young woman who serves as Sir Edmund's private secretary, whose surname, if I am not mistaken, bears closer examination than we have yet given it. Chapter 12. The Truth of Vera Conti. It was a matter of some hours' careful inquiry, conducted partly through Commissario Salviati's official channels and partly through Poirot's own discreet questioning of the household staff, before the final piece of the puzzle was secured. Vera Conti, it transpired, had been engaged as Sir Edmund's secretary some 18 months previously upon the recommendation of an employment agency in Milan, and her personal history, when traced, revealed a most significant fact. She had been raised from infancy by adoptive parents in Verona, her true parentage unknown to her, or so she had always believed, until a private investigator, engaged by an unnamed client some weeks past, had approached her with documentary proof that her birth mother was none other than Henrietta Ashworth, and her father, Sir Edmund Ashworth himself. Poirot, summoning Vera Conti to the study that afternoon, found her composed but watchful, as though she had anticipated, with the resignation of the long-cornered, that her hour of reckoning had arrived. "You knew, mademoiselle, did you not, before Sir Edmund's death, that he was your father?" She did not attempt denial. "I learned it some 3 weeks ago, Monsieur Poirot. A man came to me, an investigator Sir Edmund had engaged, though he did not at first reveal on whose behalf he acted, and showed me papers, records of my birth and adoption, that left no doubt of the matter. I confronted Sir Edmund directly. He confessed it freely enough, indeed seemed almost relieved to have it known, and told me he intended to acknowledge me formally in his will, to provide for me as a father ought." "And what was your reaction to this news, mademoiselle?" Her composure cracked, briefly, revealing the turmoil beneath. "I did not know what to feel, Monsieur Poirot. I had loved Gerald for nearly a year by then, loved him honestly, whatever Sir Edmund believed of my motives, and Sir Edmund's confession placed me in a position of unbearable complication. I was his daughter, and Gerald his nephew. We were, by the laws of both blood and propriety, now cousins of a sort, and our engagement, already opposed on grounds of unsuitable rank, became a matter of far graver complication still. Did you fear, then, that Sir Edmund's intended toast, his promise of honesty soon to be revealed, referred to the public acknowledgment of your true parentage before the whole assembled company?" "I feared it precisely, Monsieur Poirot. I feared that Gerald would learn, in the cruelest possible manner, before his family and his uncle's guests, that the woman he loved was his own first cousin, that our engagement, our every plan for the future, would be exposed as something shameful, something to be pitied and whispered over for years to come. I could not bear it. I went to Sir Edmund's study before dinner concluded, while he yet sat at table, and removed the folder containing the investigator's reports from his desk, hoping to destroy the evidence before he could act upon it. "And did you succeed in your purpose, mademoiselle?" "I removed the folder, yes. It is hidden still among my own effects, Monsieur Poirot, and I will surrender it to you gladly, for I see now that its concealment serves no purpose but my own continued suspicion. But Sir Edmund's intention to acknowledge me was not contained solely upon paper. He meant to speak it aloud, regardless of what evidence I removed from his desk, and I knew this, for he had told me so himself, not 2 hours before." "Then you understood, mademoiselle, that the removal of the folder would not prevent the revelation you so dreaded?" "I understood it, yes." Her voice had dropped almost to a whisper, "which is why, Monsieur Poirot, when I went to him in his study at 10:30, the very hour he had arranged to meet with you, I went not merely to remove papers, but to plead with him, one final time, to keep his silence, to allow Gerald and myself the dignity of choosing, in our own time, how and whether to learn the truth of our connection. And did he agree to your plea, mademoiselle? Vera Conti's eyes, when she raised them to meet Poirot's, were bright with unshed tears. He refused me utterly, Monsieur Poirot. He told me that he had kept secrets and obligations buried too long already, that he meant to die, when his time came, an honest man rather than a hypocrite, and that I must learn to bear the truth as he himself had been forced to bear the consequences of his own youthful follies. We quarrelled bitterly. I left his study in tears, no later than 20 minutes past 10, and Sir Edmund was alive when I left him, agitated, certainly, but very much alive. Can you prove this, mademoiselle? I can offer only my word, Monsieur Poirot, which I am aware carries little weight in light of what I have already confessed. But I did not kill him. Whatever my fear of his confession, I could not have brought myself to murder my own father, however briefly and painfully I had come to know him as such. Poirot regarded her in long, considering silence. It was, he reflected, an account both plausible and incomplete, and one that left, still unanswered, the question of who else might have entered that study in the crucial minutes following Vera Conti's departure, before Sir Edmund Ashworth met his death. Chapter 13. The Gathering. That evening, Poirot requested that the entire household assemble in the great drawing-room of Villa Serenella, a request that Commissario Salviati, recognizing the moment for what it was, supported with the full authority of his office. The company gathered with the particular tension of those who know that judgment approaches, though none perhaps fully anticipated the precise nature of the revelations to come. "Mesdames, Messieurs," Poirot began, standing before the assembled company with his hands clasped behind his back, his small dark eyes moving from face to face with the patient deliberation of a man who has, at last, assembled every piece of his puzzle into its final and inevitable pattern. I have spent these past 4 days listening to the secrets of this household, secrets of love and loss, of pride and fear, of old wounds never fully healed. Each of you, I think, believed your own secret to be the one that drove a murderer's hand. I am here tonight to tell you that you were, every one of you, mistaken, save in one particular. He paused, allowing the silence to deepen. Sir Edmund Ashworth's toast, that fatal evening, spoke of secrets soon to be revealed, and you each assumed, in the natural anxiety of guilty consciences, that he referred to your own private failings. Madame Henrietta feared exposure of an old engagement broken for fortune's sake. Monsieur Trevelyan feared exposure of dealings conducted behind his partner's back. Monsieur Gerald feared the loss of an inheritance threatened by his choice of bride. Madame Ashworth feared exposure of a faithless correspondence. And Mademoiselle Conti, he turned to Vera, who sat very still beside Gerald, her hand clasped tightly in his, feared the revelation of a parentage that threatened to destroy her happiness entirely. All of this is true, Poirot continued, and yet none of it, mes amis, constitutes the motive for murder. For consider, if any one of you had acted in panic, in the desperate fear of imminent exposure, the crime would have borne the marks of haste, of improvisation, of passion's clumsy hand. But this murder, mes amis, was no crime of passion. It was a crime of careful preparation, a crime planned in advance by someone who knew, before that fatal toast was ever spoken, precisely what truth Sir Edmund intended to reveal, and who had taken pains, already, to prevent it. He turned now toward the window, where the lake lay dark and silent beneath the rising moon. The digitalis used to kill Sir Edmund was obtained not in a moment of desperate improvisation, but with deliberate forethought. The lock upon Dr. Ferranti's cabinet, picked with a skill that speaks of preparation, not panic. The body was carried to the boathouse and arranged with a care that speaks of calculation, not haste. And the locked drawer in Sir Edmund's study, forced open, we now know, by Mademoiselle Conti in a moment of desperate fear, had already been searched once before, by a hand more careful than her own, seeking not merely papers, but the proof of a secret this person had learned of weeks before that fatal dinner. The room had gone entirely silent. Every eye in the company turned, as one, toward the figure who sat at the room's edge, quiet and composed throughout Poirot's long recitation, dressed still in unrelieved black. "Madame Henrietta Ashworth," Poirot said softly, "I think it is time you told us the truth of where you were, and what you did, on the night Sir Edmund Ashworth died." Chapter 14. The Truth of Henrietta Ashworth. For a long moment, Henrietta Ashworth said nothing at all, her dark eyes fixed upon Poirot with an expression of such weary resignation that he understood, even before she spoke, that his accusation had found its mark. "You are very clever, Monsieur Poirot," she said at last, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "Clever enough, I think, to have already guessed most of what I am about to tell you. Very well, I will not insult either of us with further denial." She rose from her chair, drawing herself up with something of her old dignity. "I learned, some 3 weeks past, that Edmund had discovered the existence of our daughter, the child I bore him before my marriage to William, given up in shame and secrecy nearly 20 years ago. I learned, too, that he intended to acknowledge her formally, to provide for her in his will, to speak openly at last of a sin we had both, for 2 decades, kept carefully buried. You will understand, Monsieur Poirot, that this was not, for me, a matter of simple scandal. It was the unravelling of every careful fiction by which I had constructed what remained of my respectability. You feared, then, not merely the exposure of an old indiscretion, but something graver still." "I feared," Henrietta said, her voice dropping, "that Edmund's confession would reveal not merely that I had borne a child out of wedlock, but the full and terrible truth of how that child came to be conceived, not through some youthful romance, Monsieur Poirot, but through a liaison that began after my marriage to William, his own brother. Vera is not the daughter of a broken engagement, as Edmund led his solicitor to believe. She is the product of an affair conducted during my marriage, a betrayal of William's trust that I have carried as the heaviest burden of my life. Had Edmund spoken the full truth, I would have stood exposed not merely as a woman who loved unwisely in her youth, but as an adulteress who betrayed a good man's trust under his own roof. And so you went to his study, madame, intending to prevent this confession by whatever means necessary." "I went intending only to plead with him, Monsieur Poirot, as I had pleaded for 3 weeks past, without success. I went to his study some minutes before 10:30, before you yourself were due to arrive, and found him there alone, already somewhat agitated from his earlier quarrel with Vera, whose tears he had evidently found more troubling than he cared to admit. I begged him, one final time, to keep his silence, to find some other means of providing for our daughter that did not require the public destruction of every reputation I had spent 20 years constructing." "And his response, madame?" Tears stood now in Henrietta Ashworth's dark eyes, though her voice did not break. "He laughed at me, Monsieur Poirot. He told me I had grown tiresome in my fear, that he was tired of secrets, tired of lies, tired of the careful fictions by which we had all conducted our lives for 20 years. He said he meant to speak the full truth that very night, before you arrived, so that you might witness, as an independent and respected observer, his act of long overdue honesty. I begged him, I wept, and when he turned from me, dismissive, to pour himself a glass of brandy, I saw upon his desk the small case in which Dr. Ferrante had, some weeks before, left a supply of digitalis for Edmund's own heart condition, intended for his private use should the need arise. And you took the syringe, madame, and administered the fatal dose. I did, Monsieur Poirot. God forgive me, I did. He did not even struggle greatly. The heart, you understand, was already weakened by years of poor habit, and the dose I administered, in my panic, was very great. He died within minutes, there in his own study, and I, her voice broke at last, I dragged his body to the boathouse, using strength I did not know I possessed, and arranged him in the water to suggest an accidental fall, hoping against hope that the truth might never be discovered, that I might yet preserve, through one final desperate act, the respectability I had spent a lifetime protecting. And the folder, madame, the papers concerning Vera's true parentage, I searched for them that same night, Monsieur Poirot, hoping to remove all evidence of the investigation Edmund had commissioned. I did not find them, for Vera herself, as you have now revealed, had already removed them earlier in the evening. I left the drawer locked once more, in haste, and returned to the terrace before the alarm was raised, believing my crime concealed. The room remained in stunned silence. Commissario Salviati rose slowly from his chair, his face grave. "Henrietta Ashworth, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Sir Edmund Ashworth." "I do not contest it, Commissario," she said quietly, her composure returning even now, in this final moment of exposure. "I have carried this burden long enough. I am almost grateful, I think, to set it down at last, whatever the cost." Chapter 15. The Reflection by the Lake. Some hours later, when the formalities of arrest had been concluded, and the household, exhausted by the long ordeal of revelation, had at last begun to disperse to their separate sorrows, Poirot found himself once more upon the terrace, alone beneath the same stars that had witnessed, only days before, the beginning of this tragic affair. Commissario Salviati joined him there, offering a cigarette which Poirot, with characteristic fastidiousness, declined. "A sad business, Monsieur Poirot," Salviati said, leaning upon the stone balustrade. "A mother who killed to protect a secret already half revealed. A daughter who never knew, until these terrible days, the truth of her own birth. A family destroyed by 20 years of careful, well-intentioned lies." "It is always so, mon ami," Poirot replied softly. "Murder is rarely the work of monsters. More often it is the final, desperate act of ordinary souls pushed beyond the limits of what they can bear. Souls who have told themselves one small lie, and then another, and another, until the accumulated weight of deception becomes a burden they will do anything, even kill, to avoid setting down before the world's eyes. What will become of them now, the girl, Vera, and young Gerald? That, Commissario, is no longer a matter for the police, nor even, I think, for an old detective grown weary with the sorrows of this case. They are cousins, as Madame Henrietta's confession has made plain, and whatever future they choose to build together, it will not be the future either imagined when they fell in love, ignorant of the truth that bound and separated them in equal measure. Poirot sighed, gazing out over the dark water. Sir Edmund Ashworth was not, I think, an evil man, merely a vain one, who mistook the confession of old sins for an act of courage, never considering that the truth, however righteously intended, can wound as deeply as the lie it replaces. "And Madame Henrietta, do you pity her, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon the lake's dark, unrevealing surface. "I pity her, Commissario, as I pity all who are driven to violence by fear of exposure rather than by malice. But pity, you understand, is not exoneration. She took a life to preserve a fiction, and in doing so she has destroyed far more than the secret she sought to protect. She has shattered the happiness of her own daughter and condemned herself to spend whatever years remain to her in far greater confinement than any she imposed upon herself through 20 years of careful silence." He drew his coat more closely about his shoulders against the cool night air rising from the lake, and allowed himself, for a moment, the small satisfaction of a puzzle solved, a truth uncovered, however painful that truth had proven to be. "Come, Commissario," he said at last, turning from the water toward the lighted windows of the villa behind them. "There is nothing more for either of us to do here tonight. Let the household grieve as it must, and let us leave them, at last, to whatever peace they can find in honesty, however dearly that honesty has been purchased." And so it was that Hercule Poirot, his holiday somewhat more eventfully concluded than he had anticipated, took his leave of Villa Serenella the following morning, carrying with him, as he always did, the quiet satisfaction of justice served, and the equally quiet sorrow of having witnessed once again how very far the human heart will travel, down paths both desperate and tragic, in its endless effort to outrun the truth of its own past. The end,